What's up guys, Haking here, bringing you a new video regarding Resident Evil 9. Remember to like and subscribe please. And yeah, today's topic is just going to be a discussion video. And it's going to be on whether or not Jill is going to be in RE9. And why I think she's not going to be in it. And why I personally think Capcom has some sort of vendetta against Jill. As in, they don't like Jill, they don't want to use Jill. And the reasons for that, I'm going to explain why, and why Jill is not such a prominent character in the series for a long time now. So yeah, there's going to be sort of a controversial topic, but I thought it'd be fun to do. So yeah, let's discuss and see where I go with this. Maybe it makes sense, maybe it won't. But hey, at least it's something to do, right? So yeah, let's get into this then, guys. So yeah, Jill's role in the series thus far, right? She was one of the main characters of RE1, she was the main character of RE3, and then since then she's pretty much been disposed of, being treated as a damsel in distress, as a side character in what is pretty much meant to be her own series. Let me explain further by this. So, main character in 1, obviously, and then with 3, you gotta keep in mind, Resident Evil 3 was originally intended to be a side game, which they then made into a main numbered title. And they decided to have Jill be the main character in that because they already explained in RE2 that Chris and Barry had gone to Europe. Now, I believe that info also mentioned that Jill had joined them as well, but that got retconned with RE3 because they needed at least one returning character to come back, and Jill made the most sense. Personally, I would have had RE3 be about Jill and Rebecca, but because Shinji Mikami was not a big fan of Rebecca Chambers for some reason, that didn't pan out. So it's kind of disappointing they didn't do that. It would have been nice to have had a story where the men are away trying to stop Umbrella from in this new location, while you had the female leads in Raccoon City trying to figure out what was going on and stop Umbrella from there. And of course, eventually it all going poop and them having to escape together. That would have been a good story to do because we never got to see, Jill and Rebecca interact. So it's kind of a shame they didn't do something like that. But going forward, we go into Resident Evil 5, and that's the next time we see Jill, and she's pretty much treated like a side character, essentially. She plays a big important role, yes, but when the game initially starts, she's been killed off screen. And it takes a few hours playing the game before you get to the chapter figuring out what happened. And then eventually, of course, you get the big twist that, oh no, this mysterious lady that's been going around causing some trouble is actually a brainwashed Jill. And then you end up having to rescue her from Wesker. You fire, you rescue her, and then instead of her joining you, she disappears again. Like, this is Jill bloody Valentine. She should have been one of the main characters of RE5. Early developments for the game initially had her be a secondary main character in this game, but for whatever reason, they decided to make her into this damsel in distress in RE5 instead. Now, it works for the plot, it does, but it would have worked a hell of a lot better if she had joined Chris in the final act against Wesker. Instead, they just kept it with Sheva, and I get what they were going for, but I'm not particularly a fan of that. If you're going to have this final game where Chris and Wesker fight, Jill should definitely be involved because she's got history with him as well, so it's kind of silly they didn't do this. And then of course we ended up getting DLC with Jill where, yeah, it was fun, don't get me wrong, but still, she feels like a side character in what is meant to be this main numbered game. Like, it's kind of crazy to think about. I don't know what the main issue with this, I think we all do actually, I say I don't know, but we know what the main problem was. It was the controversy of RE5, and I think that's what caused Capcom to basically cut Jill from a secondary main playable role to Sheva, because Sheva originally was meant to be this NPC character, but she got turned into a secondary main character instead, and Jill was relegated to NPC/side character instead, which is kind of a shame. And then you'd think after that they would bring Jill back, right? Because you look at like what RE6's concept is, and you think, oh yeah, this makes sense. We're gonna do this big game. We're gonna have all these returning characters. We're going to have Jill come back in this with Chris and team up. No, they didn't do that. Instead, we ended up with this totally crazy over-the-top story that when you look back on now, you realise, man, they really screwed the pooch with this game. When you look back on Resident Evil 6, you sort of start to realise how the series nearly died, essentially, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, because it's very weird, because in a strange way, RE6 as is at least somewhat similar to what RE4 did. You have RE4 coming out, and it's essentially this big reboot of the series, right? This big semi-reboot. It changes up the gameplay for the better, in my opinion. But when it comes to story, lore, and characters, it completely drops the ball. Yeah, you got Leon there, you got Ada there, you got Reska sort of making a cameo there. You got some references here and there, but it's not very deep. It's not very well developed. And even Shinji Mikami himself, said that it was rushed. It was rushed. This was a very rushed game, at least when it comes to the script. The script, which I believe he wrote in 3 weeks or a month or something. It wasn't a very well developed script. And yet the game did phenomenal, which is both not surprising and surprising at the same time, because it doesn't feel or play like a Resident Evil game. And I'm all for them switching up the gameplay. I don't mind that, but you go from something like Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, and Code Veronica, where you got a lot of this setup, and then you go to Resident Evil 4, and it completely ignores everything that came before. And then we had to wait till Resident Evil 5 for the main plot to continue again. And they did a decent job with it, for the most part. I did recently replay it, and it is fun to sort of look at it and go, there's a lot of stuff in this game that's just there for gameplay's sake. Like if they did a remake of this, there's a lot they can expand on and improve, definitely, for sure. But yeah, going back to Resident Evil 6, we had the main story, we had everything wrapped up, and then we went into 6. And you look at 6 and what they're doing with it, and it's wouldn't it have made more sense for RE6 to be a reunion with all the main characters? Wouldn't it have made sense for Chris's campaign to be about Chris and Jill having to deal with the aftermath of her time being under control on the Wesker, and Chris dealing with with him having finally defeated he's a nemesis and having to look after Jill? And then of course Leon's campaign should have been Leon and Claire. I mean, that would have made a lot, especially with Sherry coming back and Chris being in it. It would have made a lot of sense to have Claire in it, because if you're doing a game with Chris and Leon, would have also made sense to add Jill and Claire together as well. Imagine the game we could have gotten. Imagine the game we could have gotten where Leon and Claire reunite, and then you get that segment in the middle of the game where they reunite with Sherry. That would have been a more powerful moment, and it really isn't. And I need to support RE6. I need to give it, a lot of people need to give it smack, because there are good elements to RE6. There are. I do like the Chris and Pierce storyline. I do like the characters of Jake and Sherry and their theme, which deals with sins of the father. These two children of these two evil villains coming together and hoping to save the day. I think that's very terrifically done. But then you look at Leon's campaign, and there's barely any story to it. It's just a whole bunch of nonsense. Simmons isn't very well developed, and what should have been Ada's, backstory and origins being revealed ended up being nothing, because it's about this other character. And yeah, it just, like I said, it feels like nonsense. It feels like they really had no idea what direction to go to, when the direction should have been obvious. RE6 should have been a game about Chris and Jill, Leon and Claire, and obviously you keep Jake and Sherry, and with Ada you should have added at least a partner or something. But the whole clone thing shouldn't have been in there. The whole doppelganger thing shouldn't have been included. Simmons should have just been the main villain. Ustanag as his henchman, perhaps. And yeah, there should have been a bit more focus on actual character development. With Leon dealing with the US conspiracy and that. And obviously dealing with the fact that, the reason he became a government agent in the first place was to protect Sherry, and having that sort of come into fruition, but they didn't do that. And you look at what, you look at the controversy with 5, and how Capcom had to deal with that, and in the direction they had to go with. And then you look at RE6, and it's like, yeah, it makes sense. Action sold, so they went more into it. But the biggest problem with 6 was they tried to appeal to the Call of Duty crowd, and that didn't work out to their favour. And then, of course, the story it didn't work. You look at RE6 and you realise, man, they really did screw it up. They really did screw it up. And it makes a lot of sense why they would reboot. It makes a lot of sense why Revelations 2, for example, went in the direction it did. Because, again, it's history repeating itself. You had RE4, it didn't continue the plot from Code Veronica. You had RE5, it did continue the plot from Code Veronica. And then you had RE6, which, again, was sort of its own thing. It felt like it was meant to continue, but it didn't. It was doing all of this stuff, it was setting a lot of this stuff up, and it went nowhere in the end. And then we ended up with Revelations 2, which did continue a lot of the loose ends from RE5, what with Alex Wesker and Ouroboros and that being connected, whilst playing as new characters, or in this case, and returning characters with like Barry and Claire. So that was really well done. But again, like, it makes sense as well why they ended up going the direction they did with RE7, because Revelations 2 I think did well enough that Capcom realised, yeah, we need to go back to the horror, because 6 really did screw the pooch. They went way too into the action element with 6 when they should have stuck with a balance of horror and action, and they didn't really do that. They didn't accomplish that. So it makes a lot of sense why 7 went in the direction it did. And it makes a lot of sense why 8 went in the direction it did. Because, again, a lot of these RE games, you get a game, right, and then the next game doesn't follow on with that character or that story that they set up. And in the end, you're just waiting years and years for the story to continue. So it makes a lot of sense why 8 was a direct sequel to 7, because they looked at it and they realised, let's conclude this story with Ethan. We've set this character up. Let's go ahead with him. Let's continue with him and do some more stuff with it. And I thought that was pretty much fine. They did that, and then they were smart enough to do a DLC with it to wrap, more of the stuff up with it, so they can pretty much say, yeah, this is done. This is it. We're not doing any more with Ethan and the Winters. We're wrapping it all up with this game and the DLC, and done. It was handled, in my opinion, very well. It's what a lot of the RE games should have been doing in the first place, instead of constantly doing like, here's a story, and now we're going to do this B story next. And you're not going to go back to the A story until perhaps the next game. And that's one of the issues with RE9 going forward, which I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail. So yeah, we got RE9 coming out now. You've got the director of Revelations 1 and RE7 coming back to direct it. And the big hope is that Joe is in it, but I don't see it happening, because like I've explained, they've treated Jill like a side character in what is meant to be her own series. Like, the core main characters are Chris, Leon, Claire, and Jill. But Jill has been sidelined, and you can make the argument that Claire was sidelined as well, but Claire at least had a story pretty much completed by the time of Code Veronica, so she never felt like one of those characters that was meant to constantly return. But if you're going to bring her back, at least do something good and smart with it, and they tried to do that with Revelations 2. I think they did a decent job with that, but, her personality was a bit different compared to other appearances, so it wasn't like this great game with Claire, unfortunately. They did a better job with Barry and Moira and Natalia than they did with Claire. But with Jill, it's like, yeah, she's just been missing. She should have been in RE6 in Chris's campaign. She should have. She wasn't. And since then, it's just been this focus with Chris in RE7 and RE8, and it makes sense. Again, yeah, he's the main character. He's the main hero. So it makes sense that they would use him and for the plot in that, especially when it involves the BSA, of course. But you're looking at Resident Evil 9, and you're looking at what the story for that is going to be, in terms of the fact that it's going to be this, like, going back to Raccoon City and this big government conspiracy involving the FBI and that. And it kind of makes sense that Leon would be part of this story. So it makes no sense for Jill to be involved unless there's some sort of BSA plot tie-in. But I don't see it happening. I know a lot of leakers have said, oh yeah, Jill's in this, and other leakers have said she's not, or she was originally in it and now she's cut. I don't see it happening. I don't see Jill being in this, unfortunately. I really don't. It makes no sense for her to be connected in this plot. And I do see Capcom going back to what they did before, which is, they give us this A story, and then they give us this B story next. Or if you will, they give us this part 1 story, and they give us this other, actually A and B makes more sense, doesn't it? A and B, yeah. And then they go back to the A story again with the next game. So I do see Resident Evil 10 technically being the game that's going to continue the story of Chris and potentially Jill, because after Resident Evil Death Island, there was a lot of demand for Jill to come back as a playable character. And again, that's crazy to think about, because it's been years since Resident Evil 5, and especially Revelations 1, where they had Jill be a main character in that they finally brought her back in a CGI film. It's very similar to sort of what happened with Claire, I guess, because she had Code Veronica, and that was a game that came out in 2000, and then she didn't appear in any sort of story or canon story until, I guess it was 2007 or 2008 when I think it was 2008 when Resident Evil Degeneration came out, or perhaps it was early 2009. But yeah, we didn't have anything with Claire until then, and then we didn't get her back in the games until again another few years later. I think a good 5 years later, 4 or 5 years later, with Revelations 2. So maybe perhaps they're doing the same thing here with Jill here. They introduced her in the CGI film, and she's going to come back in a game. Perhaps Revelations 3, perhaps RE10 in the next few years. Maybe, I don't know. But I don't expect to see her in RE9 because I honestly do think Capcom doesn't care about her anymore. I do think that, because you also have to look at Resident Evil 3 as an example of how much Capcom doesn't care. Like I think the main thing they care about when it comes to RE3 is the destruction of Raccoon City and a nemesis, and that's really it. Like, that's really the only highlights you ever get when it comes to RE3 content, because you only have to look at, for example, how they butchered RE3 in the Umbrella Chronicles retelling, where they had none of the supporting cast with the exception of Jill and Carlos, and that was it. And then the nemesis doesn't appear in that campaign until like the third level, and it all takes place in the RPD station after that. And it's just dismal how they handled that. That was a very bad retelling. A lot of the retellings in that game were bad, I think. Like RE1 didn't even have Barry in it, for example. And then with Dark Side Chronicles, Capcom realized, hey, they realized they took the piss with the retellings of RE1, 0, and I think 0 for the most part was actually done well, but it was mainly RE1 and RE3 where they really screwed up. And they looked at that and they realized, okay, we need to do a better job, so let's make sure that the retelling of RE2 and Code Veronica at least is better handled. And I think they did a better job with those two campaigns than they did with RE1 and RE3. But then they had the chance. They had the chance to improve things with the RE3 remake, right? And they still screwed the pooch with that. Like, I'm going to say it, right? I like these remakes. I do. I love RE2 remake. I do like RE3 remake, but I also hate RE3 remake. For me, it's a very love and hate relationship, because there's a lot of good stuff in RE3 remake. And honestly, the bad stuff, I wouldn't say there's any bad stuff in RE3 remake. The bad stuff about RE3 remake is how short it is, and how there's a lack of puzzles, and how they cut areas. My biggest problem really with RE3 remake is I wish it was longer, because it should have been longer, and it wasn't. Imagine if they had included the clock tower scenario and it had been a big puzzle area. I would have been fine with that. But for whatever reason, Capcom deemed RE3 unnecessary to put the amount of love into it that RE2 remake and especially RE4 remake got. Maybe it is because of the choice of developers. You gotta keep that in mind. Maybe it is simply because you had the wrong people working on it. Maybe if the team that did RE2 and RE4 had worked on it, it would have ended up being a more full-fledged, better game. Because as it is, it does feel like DLC to RE2 remake instead of being this full-fledged game. And I've always said this as well, RE2 remake and RE3 remake had to walk so RE4 remake and Separate Ways DLC could run. I feel like those two games were a prime example of, okay, we're doing this, and eventually they're going to do these next games and they're going to be better. And I feel like history is going to repeat itself when it comes to RE0 and Code Veronica again, because I do see RE0 being this very small-fledged game similar to how RE3 remake was handled, and Code Veronica being the bigger one, because that's the one they need to get right, 100%, definitely. But then that also begs the question, where does that leave the next remakes? And obviously I do feel like if we're going to get an RE6 remake, if we're going to get an RE0 remake and a Code Veronica remake, we're definitely going to end up getting another RE remake. And that's the one where I feel like Capcom's either going to look at that the same way they're going to look at RE3 remake and potentially RE0 remake and make that into a very small sort of game, or they're going to give it the respect it deserves, and they're going to give us more Chris, they're going to give us more Jill, they're going to give us more Wesker, they're going to give, they're going to give us RE Engine, Barry, and Rebecca Chambers. Obviously, we'll probably get Rebecca in 0 first. But yeah, anything could happen. It could be a case of, like I said, they do 0 on Code Veronica, and they're going to be similar to what they did with RE2 and RE3 remake, and then RE1 remake and RE5 remake are going to be these bigger games. They're going to be like, okay, we did these, and now we're going to do these, and they're going to be better. And it's like, here you go. And that's kind of what I'm thinking is going to happen. But yeah, it's just interesting to sort of look back on the history of all of this and figure out how things are going to go forward. Because, like I said, I really don't expect Jill to be in this game. I really don't. I'm not expecting her to show up until the next game potential, and even then, I don't know. Even then, like, it has to be fan demand. It has to be a case of fans going to Capcom and going, hey, put Jill in the next main numbered game. Like, we want her back. We don't want her in some spin-off. We don't want her in a side game. We want her in a main numbered title. So, fingers crossed that happens. And fingers crossed that they do a better job with the upcoming remakes. Like I said, I don't hate RE remake. I always get a lot of people complaining in the comment section, oh, the remakes are bad. The remakes aren't bad. The remakes are developed very well. They're very good separate entities. They're very fun games. Let me make this very clear. When it comes to fun and replayability, the remakes are great. Okay, all the RE Engine games they have done have been great so far, especially when it comes to the fun aspect and the replayability, because I can't say the same thing when it comes to some of the other older games. Like, RE0 for me is not fun. Code Veronica for me is not fun. But RE2, RE3 remake, and RE4 remake, and Separate Ways DLC, they are fun, including, especially with RE7 and RE8. These are fun games to play. And Capcom have done a good job with that, because you do get a lot of games, you do get a lot of sequels, you do get a lot of IPs. They're not fun to play, but these games are. And yes, there are mistakes, but in no ways is it a case of, does it make it a bad game? It's not a bad game, it's just not a great one. It could have been greater, it could have been much better. But what we got is basic, is simple, is decent to good enough. But we know it could have been better. It's the same case when you watch a movie. You watch a certain film and you're like, man, this could have been so much better if they'd done this. And it's pretty much what I'm saying here right now as well when it comes to like older games. Like, I look at RE6 and it's like, man, RE6 could have been so much better had they done this instead of what they did with it eventually. But, that's a case of, okay, yeah, they did screw the pooch with that. And with this one, it's like, yeah, they did screw the pooch with some of the aspects, but it's still good. Does that make sense? Like... But yeah, I'm just curious how things are going to go. I'm very curious what RE9 is going to do. I'm curious what characters will return in it. I mainly do think it's going to be Leon and hopefully Ada, and that's it. If another character from like 7 or 8 appears or shows up, I most likely think it's just going to be Chris. Like I said, I don't expect Joe in this. Unless they do some sort of clever setup and Joe ends up being like a DLC character for the game. Because... yeah, I know a lot of people are going to say this, and I do agree with you all. You're going back to Raccoon City, and it would make sense to have a lot of, like, survivors of Raccoon City show up in it. Leon definitely makes sense, but the one that makes the most sense would be Jill. So to go back to Raccoon City and not have Jill come back would be crazy, right? But then at the same time, you could easily just have Chris be in there as well, because Chris lived in Raccoon City. I keep having to say this and remind people, Chris did live in Raccoon City. It's East City as well. He would know certain things. He would know the environment. So, it doesn't have to be this big focus of, oh yeah, Joe has to come back. You could easily do Chris, and Chris goes for the, the whole remembering Raccoon City part, because we never did get that with him. Like, he's the main hero of the series, and we never got anything with him regarding Raccoon City. So, like, him maybe going through these areas, these old areas that we haven't seen maybe before, and he's remembering, because you gotta keep in mind, like, we're obviously going to go back to the RPD, perhaps, properly, the ruins of it, but we're most likely going to get new areas in Raccoon City as well, and, what better character to remember those areas than either Chris or Jill, and Chris would make sense, especially if you want to tie it to 7 and 8 in a way. But, yeah, I'm just curious how this is all going to work out. Like, this is just me talking about stuff and trying to get it out there, but I don't expect Jill in this. I really don't. Like, I really don't think Capcom likes her. I really don't. And Chris and Leon have been the poster children for this series going forward since RE4, basically. So, yeah, I don't see that changing anytime. If anything, if you had to pick like a main lead heroine for the series, it's Ada, definitely. Like, because she's appeared a few times now. She in important events, and Jill hasn't. Like, she's been relegated to, like, spin-off main titles. Same with Claire. So it's like, yeah, no one cares. No one cares about Jill. Or, in this case, Capcom doesn't care. Which is really tragic when you think about it. But here's hoping that RE9 is a good game. Here's hoping that they at least wrap up some loose ends when it comes to Leon and potentially Ada. And here's hoping that if Jill has to return, it's going to be in, like, RE10. alongside Chris. Fingers crossed. That's the hope anyway. But yeah, guys, I hope you liked this video. As always, remember to like and subscribe. Apologize for going a bit too long. I've been wanting to get this out of the way for a long while. But yeah, I hope you like this. And I shall see you when I shall see you. Take care and bye. And enjoy the rest of whatever summer's left. Peace out.